One of the topics that keeps coming up in enterprise storage, and frankly is an important one as well for us all to think about in all fields of endeavor, is sustainability. Frankly, everything we're building here needs to be evaluated based on efficiency, power, cooling, waste, all these things. And yet we often don't really talk about that except in as far as it goes from commercial prospects. In other words, is this thing too big, too expensive, too hot, whatever for me to buy and use? Oh, well, then it's not sustainable. But as long as I can pay the bill, it's fine. That's what we're going to talk about here on this Tech Field Day Roundtable recorded at Storage Field Day 26 with a great group of independent delegates. Andy, I'm going to have you kick this off. Tell us a little bit about sustainability in the storage industry.
It barely exists. There's a handful of different approaches that we could take on this. There are the companies that attempt to repurpose the old equipment that they're taking out of service or recycle it appropriately. There have been a handful of discussions here at Storage Developer Conference on how to recycle old drives. That there's loads of components in there that you really shouldn't be throwing in the landfill, and at the same time, there are concerns that we can't actually give our old hard drives away because there's data on it that could potentially be mined. And it's like this seems to be a sticking point for lots of places. At the same time, there is the idea of enterprise data center sustainability, where lots of companies are now paying attention to how much power and cooling their devices take. When we heard from Solidigm earlier this morning, it was very interesting. Somebody in our private discussion pointed out that we're getting almost 1 million IOPS out of a 12-watt device. And so there's the power portion of it as well. So I think we should look at this from two different aspects, both the power consumption portion of it and the waste portion of it.
So, Chia, which is a storage crypto coin, is all kind of started out with trying to reuse hard disk drives and SSDs to try to take advantage of them to produce some sort of capability. The SSD and the power consumption versus HDDs is very significant. And you can see that happening, but quite frankly, HDDs are still the majority of the market. Still 2/3, if not 3/4 of the drives sold today are HDDs.
Well, and you can also make a point, and I think that some people have made this point recently, that HDDs are not actually that energy inefficient given, on the storage basis and also in terms of manufacturing.
Well, if you look at, from a power consumption perspective, right, you got, data centers in general take up about maybe 1 to 2% of the world's power consumption today, and it's going up. Within those data centers, I think the number is between 25 and 30% of that power is used by storage, right? So in the greater scheme of things, it's only 1/3 of the problem, right? And we're talking, of course, of scope 1, scope 2. We should all understand the differences. Like when we're talking about the materials and how they're sourced, and that's kind of scope 3 type of stuff that you got to know where stuff is coming from. And then as you're getting rid of it, that e-waste that you're producing or avoiding, right, also goes into scope 3. And honestly, in the United States, the companies I talk to, they're really way behind, say, folks in Europe that seem to have this stuff together. But said a lot of things there, but just a couple of anecdotal points to use.
But I think you got to challenge ourselves with the paradigm here, because it's not a matter of read once, write many. It's the other term, write once, read never. So you have to look at the form follows function. The devices that we're talking about, were they meant to last for 100 years? A hard disk? I don't think so. Is magnetic media in terms of like SSD and stuff, flash, meant to last for 100 years? No. You need archival storage that is durable. And we did attend one at SDC that addresses that. So I think we as an industry need to figure out form follows function and really decide how that will impact our sustainability.
Well, one of the things we heard at Flash Memory Summit on that point was that the flash makers are actually surprised, as are the industry analysts, that flash is having much longer life, active life than disk, and it's much longer than was expected. And companies are actually not buying as much flash as expected because they actually can continue to get productive use out of stuff that they bought previously. And that's been a real shakeup for the financial side of this industry. Go ahead, Michael.
So, I mean, a couple of points. Firstly, on that, I mean, yeah, that has started to surprise a lot of people. But I think equally what has surprised people is the durability of flash versus hard drive when you have the power loss events. You know, if you think about your portable hard drive, you unplug that. If you actually unplug a flash-based disk, it will start to degrade that data faster than a spinny disk. But I mean, the other thing on that I think about with sustainability and kind of flash in general, we treated it as this magic bullet. And don't get me wrong, when flash first started to hit the scenes and you started to get that in your machine, it was night and day difference. There was no disputing that at all. But one of the things that I'm concerned about with the sustainability of the storage is that if you look at what power specs were for a traditional hard drive, it was quite limited in terms of scope for peak power draw. And Scality have done this report recently where they said that actually the maximum power draw of solid state can be anywhere up to double that. So they're saying that actually hard drives are a bit more power efficient than we think. But when you then start to consider that that's not actually a ceiling, and we've seen this with graphics cards recently, that you know, we've typically tried to go for this certain amount of power efficiency. And then whenever these new features come out, and suddenly we go, okay, forget about power efficiency. Let's just go max power. Let's get the maximum performance out of this thing. Suddenly with NVMe, now we're looking at PCIe 5 generation NVMe. We're seeing 10 gigabyte read-write per second. And I'm concerned that we're going to see this continuous upward curve of power consumption.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to think about for a minute the why. You know, why as altruistic as we all want to think of ourselves as to why we're going to care about sustainability and things like that. The reality of it is your main consumer, as you were pointing out, Glenn, is going to be your data centers, and it's all going to come down to cost. And the keynote yesterday that was around sustainability really kind of hit the nail on the head that if you approach sustainability correctly, it can actually lower your TCO. And if they can fix that as the message, then at least here in the United States, where, you know, we still haven't managed to kill off coal or any number of things that are far, far better, you know, that's going to be the deal, you know, if we do that.
Eric's going next.
I got the next one.
And then Glenn, I'll go to you next.
Okay. It's actually brought me back to another part of that discussion I was thinking about, which is jumping off the fact that hard drives are better than we thought. Solid state lasts longer than we thought. The archival question starts to come in play. And then every time I started thinking about all these questions, but how do people buy storage? And this comes back to the fundamental market question that we keep running into, which is in Europe, there's a lot more data centers on-prem that are still running around. I find that when I'm in the US, I see a lot more cloud adoption going whole hog. It's not just SaaS. It's like we have done the whole Amazon migration. We've moved everything out. So every time any of these companies are buying storage, they're buying storage as an abstraction. And it's 3 layers separated from what they're buying. So the only thing they have to really link anything up is, I'm buying storage for this price. It's only if you're running your own data center that you actually get to dig into the sustainability question of going, I need to design and architect a sustainable data center. And that's not what all companies are doing. In fact, that's what fewer and fewer companies are doing. So we're starting to depend more and more. I have to pass the hand to you because working in that hosting and data center system, you probably have a much better vision of where these things are going from the fact that how do my customers feel about this and what is their driving motivator?
That is exactly what I wanted to bring up, because what I'm going to say is going to probably make a lot of people angry right here, because the things driving customer sustainability efforts, if I'm a customer, let's say I have in my own data center something that's using, let's say, I don't know, 40 kilowatts of power, and it's a storage system with some rack with some compute in it, and I move it to a place like, you know, say Equinix or someplace else that uses sustainable power. All right, a lot of customers come to us for that. Great, they get to stay I am now more sustainable. I have used 40 kilowatts of sustainable power versus the dirty power I was using before. But the flip side of this is if they're in Equinix or a sustainable place and they're using 40 kilowatts of sustainable power, and they figure out, you know what, I got this new technology, I can go down to 20 kilowatts of sustainable power, it makes them less sustainable.
They're measuring the wrong thing.
They're measuring because they're not able to take the same amount of sustainability credit because they're not using as much sustainable power as a percentage. And it drives me nuts when I hear it. So it's important to understand the difference between being efficient and sustainable. It doesn't mean that, that you shouldn't do it, but I was working on a project. I'm like, look what I can do. They can make more sustainable. And I said, no, you can't say that because you're not making them more sustainable. You're making them more efficient, and perhaps they'll save money, but they can't claim more sustainability. And this is part of the problem with the customer motivations in sustainability. As we go in this conversation, remember what matters to the corporations and that are going for this. They just want to be seen as being more sustainable in many cases. Some of them are doing it for the right reasons. Obviously, many are not, right?
And then we have in Germany, probably all over Europe, one of the problems is lots of data centers are somewhere in town areas, and they are not allowed to consume more electricity because it can't be provided there. So if they want to run their compute in the future, they may have to think about how can we be more efficient, how can we be more sustainable. The most things are actually is liquid cooling, for example, in data centers, to get the energy down.
Yeah, that's I don't know or if I want to call it an advantage, but an advantage in this discussion. That's the advantage you have there is you have a forcing function.
You're forced to do
right. We don't really have that here. I mean, we might have it in some limited areas, but
there is also not enough space in Germany to put a data center somewhere on the greenfield. You just can't do this.
We've got nothing but space, and we just need to build a few more coal-powered power plants, right? So you've got to give. It sounds like you're interacting with some companies that are being told they need to do something. They need to be more sustainable, but in this country at least, the only thing that moves the needle is either you're being forced by societal pressure, but there's not enough of that
investment,
or it's, hey, did you know you could save $10 million by getting rid of these and replacing them with those?
That's actually a really interesting point because in a lot of areas, I get a little cynical about this. I get a little cynical when I see companies announcing ESG initiatives that are really not ESG initiatives. They're E initiatives, and they're really not even that. They're just to look good, right? And we heard that from Apple at the iPhone 15 launch. They tried to do that with their ridiculous little film in the middle of the launch talking about sustainability. And frankly, it is done for the wrong reason. The thing that gives me hope is that a lot of these environmentally more friendly technologies are inevitable on a very cynical, practical basis. So, for example, solar energy is already cheaper to buy and deploy solar panels than just to keep that coal-fired plant running another month. And and that's astonishing. Well, maybe not for a month, but for a couple of years, it's just cheaper to just go solar. And I feel like, no matter what your goal is, eventually that's going to win out. And in fact, in the US, ironically, the quote, red states are adopting solar at twice the rate of the alleged blue states because it's so much cheaper and because they have a lot of sun. And it's just like it just makes financial sense. And so, that could happen in storage too. I mean, you look at, back in the day, we were deploying all these hard drives and short stroking in order to get IOPS out of them. Well, now, we've got these. That was a term, guys. Don't do this. And that's what we used to do because that was the only way we could get the IOPS. Well, now we've got 3 orders of magnitude less power consumption for the same IOPS. And it's not because they wanted to save power. It's because the technology just got better. and that could happen. So
But before you get off this topic entirely, since you're standing in front of a picture of windmills, I couldn't say for certain, but these look remarkably like the windmills I worked on in the late 1880 or late 1980.
The truth comes out.
Talk about a real graveyard in storage.
And it just reminded me that the windmills themselves didn't actually pay for themselves. The windmills were sold as investments to people who wanted the tax credits for buying a windmill. And to go along with Stephen's point, the other thing that came to mind with this, which again is not entirely is not storage related at all, but I went to visit Aramco a handful of years ago in Saudi Arabia, and their entire parking lot, they have covered parking because it gets very hot there, and the entire top of their parking lot is covered with solar panels. They don't buy any energy for their facility. They power it all off solar panels, and their business is to sell oil.
and that's the thing. At the end of the day, if it's so much better, which it is, they're going to do it. Michael?
So one of the things that we've already kind of touched upon here is that do end up, going for that, okay, this makes sense. So let's jump into it and not necessarily think of the consequences. So it was a great point raised earlier there about actually, that conversation around efficiency and, well, if I consume less power, then am I actually, am I being less sustainable? And just to kind of look at it from another perspective, when we start thinking about, consolidation down in data centers, and there was a comment as well someone made about liquid cooling. Well, there's this report that's just kind of starting to do the rounds now, and they're talking about ChatGPT and effectively the amount of water that is being consumed on servers just to cool it. And that's where we can end up thinking about sustainability in different ways, not just from the, okay, here's the amount of power available to do this, and let's try to work on it. But I think we can start to look at sustainability in a positive way for consuming less, because this report, they estimated that between 20 to 50 queries was consumed about half a litres worth of water just in terms of cooling these servers. When you think about that's just one system, and then it starts to scale out, well, actually, it does become unsustainable in certain areas. And, some of those states you're talking about, let's get a load of solar in, which then naturally makes them quite appealing for data centers, because we've got this huge abundance of clean power here and yay, sustainability. But then if they have got a lot of sunshine and they are, potentially they're a bit close to the equator, there might be a little less water available. And then suddenly we're going to get these data centers going, oh, by the way, I need to take vast amounts of this water to start cooling it. Then we can really start to do different layers of damage to local areas of the environment. And we just got to take a step back and look at that big picture. And I do think that, again, to the point that was made earlier, if we can start to go, well, actually consuming less does give us a better net benefit, looking at that way makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, well, efficiency is the easiest part because it is always related also to cost. And maybe you can have a data center in Vegas with a solar generator and spend a lot of energy to cooling the system, but it's something that can make still sense. But what we haven't touched is the efficiency is just a part of sustainability, but we miss the entire cycle, because also to making solar cell, you need a lot of material. The recycle of this material, the production of this this kind of material is very costly and has a huge impact on how they are produced actually.
And also waste.
And the waste, but also who have this kind of material that is something that is not for all the country. So maybe analyze the entire part from how is produced or recycled, because also recycle is a cost, and how is used can bring the total cost of ownership from the carbon footprint. There is the total carbon cost of ownership that can give an idea of how is sustainable a product and not only the product, how are you using, because you can have a lot of data center, but what the cost of the connection, all the clients that are using is still efficient, we don't know. There are a lot of parts that I think must also included in this analysis. Otherwise, we can say new products are just more efficient, yes, but we have to destroy or recycle the old one and consider how much cost to build the new one.
That's a very good point, because the truth is that I've heard this said about electric cars, for example, that
battery.
Continuing to use a 20-year-old gas guzzler is probably better on a total life cycle basis than buying a new electric car. Now, if that car is at the end of its life and you have to buy a new car, then it's definitely better to buy the more fuel efficient one. But it's the same with servers. I mean, the industry, the entire IT industry probably did more for sustainability by elongating the life of servers after the pandemic crash by a year or two than every solar and energy efficiency project that we've ever done. Because if you're using a server for 3 years and then throwing it out, or using it for 5 years, well, that's going to be a huge difference in terms of the total life cycle cost of that equipment.
So, but going to that, I mean, again, we have to remember that extraction of oil is not clean either, right? The amount of natural gas that's released as a function that just goes right into the air. So, I mean, I've heard a lot of the arguments, whether it's electric car batteries or some of the other things like the solar materials. The transportation, it's not against nothing. You're comparing against something. But what's going to happen? Like, think about what's going on with the AI explosion right now. We've got we're going to have, not just from a storage perspective, obviously the GPUs and the entire. We don't have enough data center power in the world to cover NVIDIA's GPU pipeline for the next 12 months. That doesn't exist. So where's that power going to come from? And we had some conversations about it. If you're going to have sustainable power, people are thinking, well, what about nuclear power? Well, guess what? Nuclear power isn't sustainable. It's carbon neutral, but it's not sustainable because it uses water, right? And think about the Phoenix area, right? They're building all these data centers in Phoenix like crazy right now. There's no water there. So how are they going to, there's going to have to be solar and these other ways. So it's this problem is so multi-layered, and between the materials that go into storage, the materials that go into the data centers, the power, how are we going to power these things? How are we going to cool them? The refrigerants in the data centers, right? They were talking in the keynote the other day about people who buy refrigerants, right? The different kinds of cooling that are being done, either to chip or to immersion, or all these. They're all attempts to try to solve this problem, and no one's figured out the best way to do it in any given situation yet. It's still free for all.
And you actually hit on a bunch of different topics that I'll mention here. The cooling issue. I mean, part of what happens with the big data centers in the desert is they can actually use evaporative cooling rather than compressed refrigerant cooling. And that's the way that Switch does it in Las Vegas area. I'm guessing that's the way they would do it in Arizona as well. Nuclear power isn't necessarily sustainable, but it I think actually has a longer run life than fossil fuels. And
water.
The comment I wanted to start off making was on your AI comment. It's there's going to be loads of GPUs, but nobody is actually using these GPUs at full load yet. And one of the main uses of GPUs to this day is mining frickin' Bitcoin.
Hey, you get 30 frames per second. Man.
Which it's not even doing anything useful. It's turning electricity into fake money.
Well, Actually, I hate to actually you. Nobody's using a GPU to mine Bitcoin
anymore.
They're using it to mine other ridiculous, useless cryptocurrencies, which is even worse because
Yes.
they're not even worth anything. No, but you're right that there is a tremendous amount of energy being sucked down by these applications that we all, back to the point of, basically the most sustainable computer is the one you didn't have to buy and that nobody had to manufacture. Well, it's the same thing with some of these things. So you got to look at the power consumption of the things we're doing and the choices that we're making. And if we're using these things for cryptocurrency that is ultimately defeating itself, or a pyramid of ever increasing energy expenditure, or if we're using these things for sort of an AI war that doesn't need to happen, then maybe we should ask ourselves if it's the most sustainable thing to do. And when it comes to storage, I think we can say that it's not just about energy efficiency. I think we can all agree with that. Energy efficiency is important, but it's also about the total life cycle of the storage. It's about the use of that storage. It's about figuring out how to, make these things make sense from an ecological standpoint. And I think that we've got a bit of an uphill battle there because, as was pointed out too, another thing that I'll kind of call out from this conversation was the fact that most people are abstracted from buying storage now. Most people are not actually buying storage anymore. It's something that you buy, that they bought, that the other thing bought, that the other thing bought, and then somewhere down there somebody made a storage decision, and it's not directly in your hands. And I think that that's another challenge when it comes to storage as well. So thank you so much. This has been a really interesting conversation.
We haven't even touched on the other part of this, which is disposal of old storage devices.
That's true.
And this is a huge thing that I touched on a little bit in my opening comments, and we haven't scratched the surface of that one. So there's another topic for some other time.
Yep, and let's talk about that. Maybe we can talk about that tomorrow. So thank you very much for joining us for this roundtable discussion at Storage Field Day 26. You'll find more of these at the Tech Field Day YouTube channel or at techfieldday.com.